Good morning, good afternoon, or good night, depending on when you're watching this thesis presentation. My name is Andrew Cerise, and the title of my thesis is The All-American, an examination of the political career of Louisiana Congressman F. Edward Hebert. Why F. Edward Hebert? Until recently, he's remained a very unimportant figure in Louisiana politics, and particularly on Tulane's campus. And my initial thesis idea did not even include him. It was on defining American conservatism in the latter half of the 20th century, with the goal of understanding the current Trump era in the context of historical American conservatism. The major problem, of course, was that this topic is way too broad, and the solution was to limit the scope of the discussion to one conservative congressman and his experiences, roughly from the period of the New Deal era to the foundation of the New Right. And Hebert satisfied two major requirements. One, his congressional tenure lasted from 1940 to 1976, which puts him squarely between those two periods. And Tulane, through the Louisiana Research Collection, had ownership of his congressional files, which were bequeathed to the university after his death in 1979. My research methods included 3 extended works, a political tract, Creed of a Congressman, an autobiography, Last of Titans, and a master's thesis, Seeds of Destruction, on Hebert and the Civil Rights Movement. But most importantly were the F. Edward Hebert papers themselves, which consist of 900 boxes of correspondence, speeches, reports, personal letters, and other ephemera, including awards and photo albums. And by the time Tulane de-densified for the coronavirus pandemic, I'd completed over 100 of the 900 boxes available, and for the 4 chapters I elected to write, I had exhausted much of the material that had been written on them. A brief introduction to Hebert's political career. He was a representative for the 1st Congressional District of Louisiana from 1940 to 1976, and during this time he witnessed the beginning and end of the Second World War, Civil Rights Movement, Second Red Scare, Korean War, Vietnam War, space race, and the Watergate scandals, and died less than a year before Ronald Reagan's 1980 victory. But most importantly for this thesis and its implications, Hebert was a conservative. Hebert was a Dixiecrat, which means that he was a registered Democrat, such as the Democrats that had come before him, both in the post-Civil War and pre-Civil War periods in the South, but he voted according to a conservative conscience and a conservative frame of reference. In multiple letters to his constituents, he wrote that he espoused and subscribed to the conservative philosophy of government, and that his position as a conservative had been firmly established. And finally, beyond merely words alone, he voted for Strom Thurmond as part of the Dixiecrat party. He voted for well-known Republican Dwight Eisenhower, for Conscience of a Conservative author and Arizona Senator Barry Goldwater, and for the man who profited most from the Southern strategy, Richard Nixon. My thesis questions were, what do Hebert's actions tell us about a Southern conservative congressman during this period? How did he view America of the second half of the 20th century? And what does Hebert's conservatism mean for the common understanding of the formation of the New Right in the late 1970s? My thesis breakdown was according to 4 chapters, the first one being politics and the economy, the second being the civil rights movement, the third being the Vietnam War, and the fourth being Hebert's personal sabotage of the My Lai war crimes investigation, which was during the Vietnam War. The first chapter is based around the idea of the original sin of power. Niccolò Machiavelli famously wrote in The Prince in the 16th century that power is an amoral idea. It's an amoral political end. One can pursue good or bad, but according to the Prince, good or bad means should only be pursued for the purpose of obtaining power. Whichever one benefited the user, the obtainer most, ought to be implemented. And for Hebert, Machiavelli's principles seem to be taken to heart, because he traded speeches in return for support from political machines in Louisiana, such as the old regular Democratic organization. And he wrote in a letter to his friend Jim Comiskey that he believed in playing the game to the hilt and taking advantage of every opportunity to win a victory. So the pursuit of power is the fundamental corrupter in particularly democratic societies. It removes the idea for compromise and turns victory into the end itself, that politics ought to be judged based upon who obtains the power rather than who is the one giving the power to the person using it. Hebert could not possibly have succeeded in Louisiana without adopting the ideas and values of his own constituents, but at the same time, he was embroiled within those very ideas. He made a name for himself in 1940, railing against the political machines that had ruined the democratic process in Louisiana, but he could not survive politically for 18 terms without belonging to the regular democratic organization which controlled New Orleans. But for Hebert, of course, that posed no problem because all that mattered to him was victory. Because without victory and power, one cannot effect change. And Hebert became enthralled with national politics and was determined to make a name for himself on the national stage as a Southern congressman. But locally, he was referred to as the Machiavelli of the Old Regulars for his endorsement of the Old Regular Democratic Organization and his machinations within it to make it the powerhouse of New Orleans politics and the politics of the 1st Congressional District. The second chapter is the sin of supremacy, which also stems from power, but a more racialized form of power. Hebert was a firm believer in the idea of white supremacy, and he believed that Black people ought to take a proper status in a dominant white man's society. The sin of supremacy and the civil rights movement in particular were of major interest to Hebert because of him being a Southern congressman, and particularly an ultra-segregationist Southern congressman. His form of white supremacy took many different characteristics, the first of which being economic discrimination, which some people might refer to as hypocrisy, but had a very logical, racial, rational motivation, which was that rejecting social spending meant limiting the amount of money that could be given to equalize African American opportunity economically in the 1st Congressional District, as well as remove government interference in the district and the state. Whereas military spending, which Hebert courted frequently during his career in the form of military bases, NASA investment, Chrysler contracts, etc., meant that Hebert could allocate money to his district, which was insolvent economically, to white constituents that worked within the factories, because those factories discriminated against Black workers. So it allowed Hebert to give money to his white constituents and preserve the idea of a white supremacist hierarchy in a segregated society economically within the 1st Congressional District. Segregation took many forms for Hebert, the first of which was an intractable character. Hebert believed that any opportunity to allow the mixing of the races or to encourage relations between the races would ultimately result in the collapse of the segregated system. He was disgusted with Black autonomy. In response to Randolph's protest against the potential, or the continuance rather, of segregation within the armed forces, Hebert said that he had never met such an ornery N-word in all his life, which is the only instance I've seen of him using this word. The historian Adam Fairclough has referred to this character, this disgust with Black autonomy, as a visceral reaction to an anti-accommodation frame within African Americans in the South. That white people could be particularly kind to African Americans that accepted their role within the segregated system, but could also be harsh and rhetorically violent and physically violent with African Americans that refused to accommodate the system of white supremacy. And A. Philip Randolph, in his refusal to allow the maintenance of segregation in the armed forces, had earned, in air quotes, the disgust of Hebert. Cultural Confederacy was yet another instance of this. Hebert and his friend Hugh Wilkinson referred to his re-election campaign in 1946 as the reimagination of the Liberty Place revolt, in which white supremacists took over the state of Louisiana in an abortive attempt to reestablish the pre-Civil War order that existed within the state. And in the latter half of the civil rights movement, the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 spelled doom for de jure segregation, or segregation by law. This meant that the South had to adopt de facto segregation in the form of white flight to the suburbs, giving vouchers for schools or for private institutions, for private academies that could discriminate because they were private, to students who would otherwise have to go to newly integrated public schools. And on a national level, this meant adopting a new strategy in which preserving segregation was given up in favor of advocating a return to segregation and putting on rose-tinted glasses regarding the character of white supremacist segregation in the South. This took the form of fear-mongering, in which Hebert demonized Black nationalists such as Stokely Carmichael, A. Trap Brown, and the Black Panthers, and tarnished the reputations of well-known nonviolent leaders such as Martin Luther King Jr., who Hebert famously quipped after he was assassinated in 1968, "When you play with fire, you get burned." And finally, it meant imagining threats regarding Black nationalism and the civil rights movement. He denounced civil rights activists who used the rhetoric of nonviolence as a weapon to incite violence and to destroy this nation, turning the very idea of nonviolence into an implicitly violent action, which it's not. White supremacy was a facet of both Hebert's character and a driver of his congressional action. He opposed every piece of civil rights legislation during his career, and once he had secured power through the old regular Democratic organization, he could pursue the ideological objectives and racial objectives of ensuring the preservation of the white Southern way of life through segregation. And when that failed, he imagined segregation as a better alternative to race anarchy that existed supposedly in the United States in the 1960s and 1970s. The sin of division is much like the sin of supremacy, except it's a political form of supremacy. And Hebert, as a member of the Dixiecrats and conservatives, was staunchly militarist, especially in regards to the Vietnam War. And this meant for the anti-war protesters who were detractors against the idea of the war movement, Hebert divided them from the true Americans that supported the war movement, changing or self-correcting a speech to read "woman who is an American" to "woman who lives in the United States of America." And even after the Nixon investigating committee reported that the National Guardsmen had acted unnecessarily in firing upon and killing students at Kent State, Hebert considered the situation to be a open and shut case of a minority of radicals breaking the law and encountering serious injury and death as a result of the so-called breaking of laws. The sin of division was created by the conditions of the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War was a saving grace and an opportunity for Southern conservatives to define a foreign policy doctrine they did not have before this moment in American history. Johnson, in return for Southern votes in favor of the Great Society reforms, endorsed the entrance of the United States into the Vietnam War on a much more extensive set of circumstances, the implementation of ground troops, for example. And for Southern conservatives, this allowed them to articulate their foreign policy of anti-communism whilst simultaneously taking away American concern and American interest in the waning civil rights movement in the United States, turning it into more of a symbolic era rather than one with substantial outcomes. And the Vietnam War, of course, went south very fast for the United States. By 1968, most Americans concluded that America could not succeed in the Vietnam War and that the best case scenario was a stalemate. Thus, American conservatives shifted the narrative from victory to patriotism, and that the persistence of America in pursuing the Vietnam War was an act and an obligation from patriotism rather than from victory. And thus, patriotic Americans would endorse the Vietnam War. This meant that true Americans were pro-war and so-called communist or anarchist subversives were anti-war. The monopolization of Americanism led to the success of the pro-war movement because it defined Americans in contrast with the anti-war movement. True Americans supported American troops. Fake Americans, or communist subversives, supported the end of the Vietnam War and relegating the South Vietnam in the circumstance, to Northern domination. This monopolization of Americanism is the formation of the modern conservative ideological bedrock because it consists of otherizing and delegitimizing the American left. This is frequently seen in Tucker Carlson's bits on Fox News and Fox and Friends, the idea that liberals hate the United States or hate what America stands for, is the root of that is found in the sin of division created by the circumstances of the Vietnam War and the conservative manipulation of the American character to perpetuate a losing conflict. Finally, the sin of legitimacy is the most blatant form of historical revisionism and the preservation of the exceptionalist character of American conservative doctrine. And this is, of course, found in the My Lai massacre itself. Hebert reported that Lieutenant William Calley and the members of Charlie Company, who killed anywhere between 150 and 500 Vietnamese civilians in cold blood, were suffering under the pressure of war and applauded President Nixon for freeing Lieutenant Calley from prison after he had been convicted of war crimes. The My Lai massacre, much like the Tet Offensive or Kent State, was a major turning point in the Vietnam War against the pro-war faction. In fact, it could have served as the destroyer of the conservative patriotic narrative, which defined American troops as exceptional in their moral character. War crimes would have made America much like any other nation, especially colonial nations such as France that had fought in Vietnam before them. The successful prosecution of the My Lai perpetrators would have given legitimacy to the anti-war narrative and would have encouraged the withdrawal of American troops and further outcry across the United States for the removal of American troops from Vietnam. For conservatives, this was an uphill battle, but one they ultimately succeeded in winning. Hebert, as the head of the investigating subcommittee of the House Armed Services Committee, collected testimony from over 100 witnesses that he used to sabotage the courts-martial. The case frequently cited is Mitchell's acquittal, which was based on the throwing out of 20 of the prosecution's star witnesses because the court could not obtain the testimony given before the Hebert Committee, which would have led to a conflict of testimony. And ultimately, Lieutenant Calley was the only war criminal convicted of committing war crimes, which allowed the conservatives to deny the allegations that Americans had committed war crimes in Vietnam, which of course meant the preservation of the legitimacy of the conservative narrative. And these sins have modern parallels. For the sin of power, partisan gerrymandering has become an immensely important facet of Republican strategy as of 2010, 2014, in redefining power structures in the United States and maintaining power within the national legislature despite not having the preponderance of support. The sin of supremacy can be found in resurgent white nationalism in the form of renewed interest and activism on the part of the KKK and neo-fascist organizations, and more covertly in the form of anti-affirmative action measures. The sin of division is the idea that liberals hate America, that Colin Kaepernick was disrespecting the flag by taking a knee against police brutality, and in our present era is Trump's response to the George Floyd protests. And finally, the sin of legitimacy. The My Lai massacre found its doppelganger in Abu Ghraib, which was exposed in 2004 as the commission of humiliating and dehumanizing war crimes by American torturers at a black site, in the Iraq conflict. Conservative congressman in 2004 declined to endorse the release of more horrifying photographs from the torture facility because they concluded it would encourage the election of John Kerry and diminish the chances of George Bush's reelection in 2004. Finally, the conclusion to the last of thesis questions, Hebert was a conservative pioneer. He was a pioneer of modern American conservative tactics and doctrine, what we see today in the Trump administration as this form of conservative demagoguery and this obsession with legitimacy and the correctness of the worldview, the obsession with law and order, with the maintenance of society as it is or the return to society as it was, that have worked as unhinging forces in American politics and society. And finally, Hebert was, if we define Americanism according to the conservative historical definition, an all-American in theory, in that he embraced the mantle of patriotism and the foundation values of the Constitution rhetorically, whilst espousing a doctrine of division and supremacy predicated upon a warped and myopic view of the world in which America and the conservative faction are exceptional in their moral characteristics and thus deserving of power, and determined to maintain that power for their own sake and for the sake of preserving the conservative doctrine within American society. Thus, the new right doesn't seem to be such a revolutionary moment in American history. If Hebert is any indication of other conservatives, both in the South and the Midwest, the Trump era is largely analogous to Hebert and other Southern conservatives. Therefore, the new right would not be the foundation of a modern conservative doctrine, but rather an anomaly compared to what the Hebert-Trump parallel suggests is the development and refining of a social conservatism predicated upon demagoguery, race baiting, and supremacy that we see both in the past and in the present. Thus, I see Hebert as a pioneer of American conservatism and as a precursor to the new right as historians have defined it. Thank you for listening to my presentation and have a wonderful day.